Hi everyone, my name is Theo and I am a climate campaigner with the Center for Biological Diversity, and I'm giving this presentation here on Chumash land in Santa Barbara. And I actually have tried to give this presentation a few times now, staring at myself in my phone video, and it was just awkward. I wasn't very good at it, to be honest. So I have asked my partner Emily to ask me a few questions and make this more of an interactive back and forth kind of a presentation where I will be exploring and talking more about my experience campaigning with California Youth vs. Big Oil, which is part of the California Youth Climate Movement, and particularly thinking about this relationship that I'm going to be exploring between organizing and mobilizing during the pandemic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Emily to start asking some questions, and I hope you enjoy this presentation.
Awesome. And sorry all that I'm not on screen, I just don't feel like it right now. So if we can start, maybe Theo, just ground us really briefly, but just, I know you introduced here with CBD, you work with California Youth vs. Big Oil. What's your job, what do you do, and what is the campaign? Just kind of give us a quick intro to that.
So as a climate campaigner here in California, I work on several different projects, one of which is building capacity and power with youth leaders in the California Youth vs. Big Oil Coalition. This coalition is closely aligned with the Last Chance Alliance, which is an alliance of 750 organizations calling on Governor Newsom to stop, drop and roll, stop new fossil fuel permits, drop existing production of oil and gas through a just transition, and roll out 2,500 foot health and safety buffer zones between oil drilling and communities. And so a lot of my work is really supporting leaders in the youth climate movement and in the youth environmental justice space, coming together and focusing our pressure and our escalating tactics on California Governor Gavin Newsom.
Awesome, yeah. So it sounds like really important work. I want to ask you, obviously right away, about kind of the biggest thing that's changed in organizing under COVID, but also if you could kind of tell us a little bit, because I think this is important for the context, like also with the California oil industry, how that has changed under the COVID context.
Right, yeah. So I'll start off with what has changed about the oil industry under COVID. What we've seen is the industry really taking a hard hit as demand for oil has decreased because people are staying at home. And what's been really noticeable actually is the bankruptcies of corporations like CRC here in California, California Resources Corporation, as well as corporations pulling out of prospective projects. For example, here in Santa Barbara, we had Era Energy, which is a combination of Shell and a child of Shell and Exxon, recently pull out of a project in Cat Canyon in the north of Santa Barbara County. So we've seen the industry get a lot more cautious about investments. We've also seen its value plummet in terms of its market value. And this has all actually been, the brunt of this has been borne out on fossil fuel workers, workers who work in the oil industry.
So it's like great for climate, but not necessarily for workers.
In some ways, yes. I mean, we've certainly seen the oil production go down, which is great for climate. But at the same time, if we're not bringing workers with us, then our long-term strategy for climate justice is deeply flawed. And so actually one of the opportunities that has opened up because of the slowing down of the industry's production here in California is the ability to forge relationships and alliances with the labor movement. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about a just transition as in the climate justice movement for some time now, but very often it may just seem like it's just words, and actually under COVID, there has been an opportunity to demonstrate concrete solidarity with the labour movement around demands for like PPE, but also around oil well remediation, so plugging oil wells that are have been abandoned or are idling, and getting people back to work in terms of remediating and closing down those oil wells. So, despite all of the tragic losses caused by the pandemic, we have also seen these opportunities for solidarity and alliance building as well. But then to answer your first question, which was what has changed for the movement, and in this case, what has changed for California Youth versus Big Oil? Well, we've really seen the narrowing of tactics available to us. If you think about the kind of tactics that social movements usually use in order to get publicity and to change the story and to escalate pressure on their targets, they're very public, they're very, they rely on mass people gatherings.
Like marches and things?
Rely on marches, on like, on civil disobedience sometimes, on mass gatherings and in demonstration of mass opposition or mass a mass sentiment, and the whole kind of idea of gathering in mass under COVID is entirely contrary to what we're being told we need to do, which is to stay at home and isolate. And isolation is terrible for movements. Movements thrive on relationships, and so that's something that has changed for all of the California climate movement, but also in this case for California Youth versus Big Oil, because the way that we had been trying to achieve social change was by escalating mass pressure on California Governor Gavin Newsom. And yeah, one example of that was the LA climate strikes back in 2019, which California Youth versus Big Oil helped support in LA, along with LA Youth Climate Strike and many, many others. Out of that, and thanks to the work of Frontline's environmental justice activists and Last Chance Alliance and many, many others, we were able to move Governor Newsom in our direction and get him to impose a temporary moratorium, a temporary ban on fracking whilst they studied its consequences for California communities, as well as got him to get much more serious about tackling corruption within his own regulatory agencies, and that was thanks to mass mobilization. And so this coalition that has formed out of that set of strategies under COVID had to reassess its strategy and to think more about what else is available to us to escalate pressure and to move the needle if we don't have the ability to meet in person. And so one thing that has really changed is having more space and more commitment to organizing. And here I'm thinking about a distinction between organizing and mobilizing, where on the one hand, organizing is doing the deep relationship building, the long-term leadership development, the capacity and infrastructure building, and the hard work of bringing people one by one into your movement, and the work of kind of that individual persuasions and really just trying to grow and build your capacity to make change. And then I see mobilizing, and this is something that the movement scholars certainly before me have identified as well, like the Engler brothers in This Is an Uprising. We have mobilizing, which is a different set of strategies focused on using the power that you have grown through organizing and focusing that on your targets to move them in the direction you want to move them. It's mobilizing in the past has been mass demonstrations. It has been nonviolent direct action. It has been the kinds of things that gets social change on people's radars in a kind of a public and mainstream way. And because our ability to do the latter has been so curtailed by COVID, we've really been forced, and that's a good thing, to have been forced to focus on the former, on the relationships. Because, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, movements are built on relationships, and that has been really the work that California Youth vs. Big Oil has been trying to achieve whilst we've been under lockdown.
That's really powerful. And I mean, now of course, like, it's not that there's any lack of targets that should be mobilized around, right? But like, it's like, as you said, now people are actually being forced to sit down and do the organizing that maybe should have been done more before and people didn't have time to do.
Yeah, exactly. And the thesis of my presentation, when it was more like a structured academic talk, was going to be that in order to come out of COVID in a stronger place than we were before it, we needed to be thinking about organizing and mobilizing in a cyclical manner. And this is not an original argument, but I do think it's one that has really been underscored by seeing how youth leaders have responded to this moment, and responded in a way that is thinking like about who we need to be building relationships with, and trying to make sure that when we come out of COVID, we're in much stronger alignment with environmental justice communities and youth environmental justice activists in particular, so that we can combine that pressure in a mobilized way and in an accountable way on Governor Newsom.
So do you think we're going to take like some maybe healthy new strategies or ways of organizing into that quote unquote after times? So like when we come out of COVID, I guess what do you hope we'll take into that space? I know you talked about these deeper relationships, but what does that look like?
I think definitely those deeper relationships, and having youth climate strikers and youth activists who may not have been to environmental justice communities before feel in stronger relationship with and in more kind of accountable to leaders on the front lines would be one thing. And I do think that a lot of the organizing that we've done online, and it is actually in some ways easier to do this online because you're not restricted by geography in the same way. It's easier to make those cross-geographic relationships work. And I think people are more committed to doing that as well, because it is one of the only options available to us at the moment. So that is something I'm really hoping and believe we will take out of the COVID moment. And that's not to say that there won't be tensions and that we've got everything right. We certainly haven't. I think there's far more work to be doing in terms of building the relationships with frontlines leaders. But I do think that the commitment is now there, and also the kind of tools and experience of doing that work for youth climate organizers is really there in a way that when I started out as a youth climate activist in the fossil fuel divestment movement, I didn't really have those relationships with the folks that I was saying I was standing in solidarity with. And I certainly felt like I was in solidarity with people who were breathing in the pollution of the oil and gas industry. But I was in a very privileged position of not having to actually myself live near that. I think that youth climate activists now have a much stronger sense of what it means when they say they're in solidarity with frontlines communities. So that's one thing that has really come out of this. And I think, what does that mean for our mobilization? I think it means that we can be more accountable, that we can actually do mass mobilization in a way that centers and foregrounds frontlines leaders, and that is, it's about connecting the public health dimensions of both the climate crisis and fossil fuel production with greenhouse gas emissions. And it's about bringing all of that home and recognizing stakes and stories and experiences are really wrapped up in this. And it's not just about particulate matter, or it's not just about concentrations of GHGs in the atmosphere. That I think that many more youth climate activists now have an appreciation for what's at stake here in California.
That's really, I mean, I love hearing you talk because it really gives me hope when thinking about the after times that our movement, right, might be coming out of this thing the other end a lot stronger. Which is this, it's both a wonderful thought, and I really have a lot of faith that that's happening because of the work that you guys are doing now, and you and all kinds of other people, right? But I guess in the reality of right now, we're not in the after times yet. It's definitely hard now. So in the meantime, I imagine there's also challenges, right, in how that organizing happens. So I wonder if you can kind of talk about some of maybe the challenges you and others are facing right now in organizing. I know one of the things that comes up a lot is Zoom fatigue.
Right.
And so if you can kind of speak to that.
Yeah, I can start off on Zoom fatigue. It's real. It's definitely, even though that you have these kind of breakdown of geographic boundaries, there's still trying to build relationships on Zoom is difficult. And so you really have to try and innovate with ways of imagining that you're all in the same room together in the way that you would as a community organizer in the real world. One thing that can be really helpful is using breakout rooms on Zoom. And if you've got a meeting with 50 people, it's really hard to kind of connect. And so breaking that down into like groups of 5 where folks can actually kind of share their stories and get to know each other a bit better, creating that space on your kind of bi-weekly meetings can be really powerful, part of the kind of relational organizing that I was just talking about. Another thing is keeping them interactive, and that's kind of why I wanted to do this presentation in a more interactive way with question and answers, is talking at a computer for 25 minutes or longer, like an hour long for some of these meetings. People tune out. They've got all sorts of other distractions. I think teachers are really learning a lot about this as well in this moment, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from school teachers about how to make organizing more interactive and exciting online. But one of the things that comes to mind is kind of using, it's really getting to the nitty-gritty, but using like the Zoom, the Google Slides, and having people click and drag things to indicate alignment on a particular issue. Something that I have found that's really helpful that we don't have in the real world is the chat box. It really allows people who are maybe more introverted to participate in meetings in ways that we don't really have, or that we should be thinking about reproducing when we get out of quarantine. I've really noticed that introverted folks are much more willing to kind of provide their thoughts in the chat box. And so you're able to include their perspectives in a way that maybe before we didn't do as good a job of. But at the end of the day, I mean, organizing in person is very different from organizing on Zoom, and that's just kind of a challenge of the work right now. There's different things you can do to get around it, but ultimately it's always going to be there. And I think another of the challenges is just like not having these exciting moments that bring people into movements. I talked about organizing and mobilizing in a cycle. Well, part of that cycle is when you've got people coming in after a mobilization, then what do you do with them? Well, you organize them and you get them into leadership roles, and you kind of build them up as people who are able to lead actions on their own and then do mobilization at a larger scale.
But it's hard to bring in new people right now.
It's hard to bring in new people right now, but it's because we can't get that kind of media attention. Yeah. And then it's also hard to direct people in terms of here's what you can do, or here's something that you can imagine yourself doing, because just of that narrowing of tactics. And so we have had to get imaginative about what's possible, and kind of there's some really exciting kind of socially distanced actions. The banner drop has come back in full force as a tactic that folks are really enjoying.
Sounds very socially distanced.
Yep, you can certainly do that socially distanced. And so just thinking about what kind of things can we still do to escalate pressure on our targets whilst doing that in a safe way, that's just a big challenge, and partly why we have spent so much time focusing on organizing at the moment.
Yeah. Also, one thing I imagine that's popping up for people, like the people that you're organizing with, how has their capacity changed? I have read things, right, like people are working longer hours. I just wonder also how that plays into this.
I mean, one of the things that you always get, whether or not you're in quarantine, is you tend to end up organizing people who are already part of a load of other different groups, and so their capacity, the amount of kind of hours and time and resources they can devote to a particular project gets overstretched, and that is part of like organizing well, is trying to reallocate who's doing what work, making sure that it's being distributed in a way that's more sustainable and more manageable. I don't know that quarantine itself has necessarily changed that. I do know that like everyone is, if you are fortunate enough to still be employed, you're probably working longer hours now than you were before. Most of Youth vs. Big Oil is volunteer based, but something that we really want to make sure we're doing is trying to make this work sustainable. And so are there ways that we can be financing youth leaders who take on more roles and more leadership so that they can actually do this on a longer term basis without burning out? And that speaks to a kind of another part of doing the organizing work, is like, well, we're in this moment where we can actually start sort of planning for trying to do some fundraising, for example. So I think the capacity question also has to be combined with like the who's doing the work question, and are they getting compensated for it?
Yeah. I guess I just have like one last question, and you can take it however you want, but just like a key takeaway for anyone who's maybe listening to this and is actively doing organizing right now or wants to be doing organizing, like what's either your biggest lesson learned or your biggest caution or your favorite idea? I know it's really vague, but like what do you want people to take away?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll come back to this thing that I've been trying to plug throughout this talk, which is thinking of organizing and mobilizing as a cycle, and seeing this moment as, as awful as this crisis, multiple crises are, overlapping crises are, being able to see this as an opportunity to build and develop those relationships so that we are in a stronger place when we come out of this, and in a place where we can be then mass mobilizing and bringing more people into our movement. But also not to forget about the organizing after this. Like, remember how important it is to be building relationships of accountability and of compassion and trust. And so I think that if we are to try and move in a direction of each mobilizing and organizing cycle getting larger and larger, so that we are able to ultimately build the kind of escalatory pressure necessary to move people like Governor Newsom, then just because we move out of quarantine, let's not forget to continue the organizing work, the relationship work.
That's really powerful. Just the thing that it leaves me with is this idea that kind of forgetting about each other is what kind of got us into a lot of these crises in the first place, right? So you're saying like, let's stay accountable to one another and work together.
Yeah, stay accountable, work together, and meet people where they're at. I think that's another thing that we've gotten better at during this period, is like recognizing the struggles that people are going through in terms of being thrown out of work, in terms of being exposed to COVID, in terms of racial injustice, and being able to meet those folks where they're at and speak in their terms and speak in terms of their needs, rather than just asking them for stuff, asking them for their time. I think that is a crucial reminder as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Emily, for asking me those questions. That made this process much easier for me, and I really enjoyed answering your questions. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of questions we get in the Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference. And thank you so much, Bridget, for putting this panel together. Really excited to hear from my other panelists, Corey and Sam, and of course Bridget. And yeah, let's just keep fighting this fight. We're not going to be in quarantine forever, and we are operating in conditions of extreme uncertainty, but in that uncertainty, I think something that I've learned is that we are together. And so thank you so much for listening to my talk.